once again, Dr. Donovan Bailey here with the Seeds of Toby podcast. This is a podcast built off of my new book, The Seeds of Toby, which is out in Barnes& and Noble, Amazon, and all the major book outlets. And I thought to do this podcast to add to the advertisement of the book and to give you all some information around the book, hopefully to entice you to go get the book, but certainly speak to the issues of in the book. It is a book towards change and pushing for change, particularly in this interesting time of 2025. Again, my name is Dr. Donovan Bailey. I am a social worker and mitigation specialist in public defender work. I've done that for 18 plus years now. I have had the privilege of working in Minnesota, Arizona, and Colorado as a mitigation specialist. Also, I've had the privilege of teaching all across this nation with regard to things that pertain to my job as a public defender, mitigation specialist, and social worker. So it's been my privilege to travel the nation to speak on behalf of things. And as I think about this book, and I talked about it a little bit last week or my last podcast, it's interesting, this book, and particularly in this new era of 2025, what it means, what it might mean. Of course, I'm not the only one thinking in regards to what is noted in this book, but definitely it's interesting in this day and time. To that point, as I spoke to in my last podcast, we are in interesting times as we entered a new political era here in 2025. Currently, it's February 8th, 2025. Almost 18 or so days into the new regime, and it's been wild and crazy. And as it pertains to the subject matter of this book, DEI, and then further, because this book is not necessarily about DEI, but getting into the criminal justice system, and then going back to what happened 5 years ago and its growth, the George Floyd movement, the bigger context of that, the George Floyd Act, which never really got passed, but still is in flux, social justice, the change movement. And the question is, and as I've had with this podcast and in regards to this book and an advertisement of this book, with the DEI being challenged, does that mean social justice and then criminal justice reform? Are those things things of the past, if you will, as it relates to this whole push to get DEI out of the picture? And when you think of DEI and some of the greater context of what seems to be developing as to why they want to thwart DEI, it certainly goes into the deeper recesses, reasons of this book, as we will get into, and certainly I'm promoting to you to get in, buy it yourself so you can get into it yourself. So as I think of this book, and we talked about it a little bit, this book is an outgrowth of my personal life, but more so my professional look at what I do as a public defender office, and particularly in regards to one specific thing, that being disparities in the criminal justice system and why those still exist. And as asked, why they still exist beyond some of the normal things that need to be dealt with, policing, issues all around mass incarceration, juries, the residuals of a racist criminal justice system or a racist criminal justice system, depending on when you last land. All kinds of issues as it relates to civil rights and the criminal justice system, in my opinion, being the main arm, if you will, of racism and enacting racism throughout the history of our America. So it grew out of, okay, why are there disparities? What more can we do? And that's how the book was birthed. In specific, I wanted to note in this podcast a precursor to this book, and well beyond my book, well beyond in the sense of competence, all kinds of things, and certainly impact, is the book The New Jim Crow, written by Michelle Alexander. 2010, she wrote this book, and it took off, and it was great. It was a great book in which she talked about disparities in a different way that lit up the country. Certainly those within criminal justice fields and human service fields that deal with criminalization. And she really hit on some really key things. I want to read something that she said to the Ford Foundation in regards to mass incarceration to give a context of what she painted in her book, The New Jim Crow. The problem isn't mass incarceration, she said to an interview with them, but mass criminalization. She said, when we think about how to address the problem of mass incarceration, the obvious solution is to let people out of prison. But that doesn't begin to address the root causes and racial injustices that have fueled the problem, historic problem. By shifting our understanding to the broader reality of mass incarceration, which takes into account a whole range of interconnected issues, including economic and educational conditions, that stir people toward the criminal justice system to begin with, we start to see approaches and solutions, like invested in employment and education for communities that have been hardest hit by the war on drugs. And she goes on in this interview with the Ford Foundation to speak to her book, Mass Incarceration. But in that one quote of which she's spoken various times, she speaks to the macro, meso, the bigger context of why there are disparities in the criminal justice system, the mass incarceration issue. She called it the new Jim Crow. And certainly we don't have time to really go into the history of Jim Crow, but certainly that was a racist thing. The new Jim Crow, as she explained, she called it a racial caste system where the criminal justice system, incarceration, mass incarceration was used to incarcerate generations of people, certainly people of color. So as I read that book and obviously dealt with many of the things I deal with in public defender work, I saw what Michelle Alexander was speaking to. And as a social worker, as a previous person that worked in residential treatment, helping people out of the criminal justice system and so on, my question was, okay, this is an amazing book that puts a mirror, if you will, on the criminal justice system. What do we do to change the problem? What do we do to change the problem? And post-Floyd, we saw a lot that needed to happen from the standpoint of policing, policies, even the bigger impact of businesses and nonprofits and government being more supportive of DEI. Again, that's why the question about is this emphasis on DEI being destroyed going to destroy a very integral movement that started in 2020. But it addressed the bigger issues of the criminal justice system. And when Michelle Alexander touched on it, I thought, okay, what more can we do to deal with this issue? One of the key issues that she brought up in her book that really impacted me and really, I think, gave her book a lot of weight was this idea of intentionality. Hear me now. Intentionality of the criminal justice system. And I will go forward to say historic intentionality of the criminal justice system to incarcerate Black and brown lives. Note the idea intentionality. And she really brought that out, and that really broadened her book. And then obviously we get this mass incarceration deal. She talks about the intentionality, which leads to a big word, recidivism, because she speaks to, and many agree to, the system is set up for folks to recidivate in the criminal justice system. So it's no shock when we talk about the prison being wasted, a wasted opportunity, because so many people recidivate at big amounts. Certainly those minority lives, this new Jim Crow, recidivate at a high level back into prison, back into the criminal justice system, back into probation caseloads, so on and so on and so forth. And as that quote I read just from Michelle Alexander, she spoke to the bigger context of this impact in the bigger context of solution of the impact. Education being one, economics being another, so on and so forth. So it stemmed from, okay, mass incarceration, the new Jim Crow, its intentionality, its impact on recidivism, keeping folks in the criminal justice system, as I quoted last time, and you'll see it quoted in this book. African Americans among Native Americans, Latino Americans, but African Americans being the biggest examples of this. 13%, 13 or 14% of the U.S. population, but being 40% of jails, 36 to 40% of the jails and prisons. That's huge. So we see this new Jim Crow and its impact, and we could go deeper on that. But I, as a practitioner, begin to ask, how in the world can we do something different to change the plight of those in the criminal justice system? Certainly, we need to do something on the front end in the sense of policing, courts, juries, a lot of the very front end racial things. But my thought went to, as we think of this new Jim Crow that Michelle Alexander so eloquently wrote about and so eloquently speaks about, after centuries of intentionality on this issue from the criminal justice system here in 2025, after decades or what have you of this going on, as she said, well, let people out of prison. That might be an obvious solution, but if we let everybody out of prison, what would happen? Because we're talking about bigger issues at play here. And I say, even in the book, if you let all these folks out of prison, the likelihood of them coming back might be high, some of them, a majority of them, because this bigger Jim Crow, this bigger systematic thing has had a collateral impact on not only the individuals that have been in prison, but generations. And that's when we get into historical trauma. That's when we get into generational trauma. And that's when we get into the idea of this book. Incarceration is one thing, as Michelle Alexander spoke to. But the bigger macro issues, or meso, and even micro, to be honest with you, that are deep rooted after generations of people being put into the criminal justice system, right, inappropriately. After that has happened over years and years and years and years and years, what does that do to people groups? What does that do to cultures? And so if we change the laws, like for instance, we changed the laws on marijuana recently, and recently, when I say recently, it's grown since Colorado did it back in, I think, 2006-ish, if I am correct. Now, many states have legalized marijuana and have gone back to retract some of the heinous laws that have incarcerated folks and letting folks out of prison, what have you. But it's bigger than that. Because when you think of the mass incarceration era, right, or the tough on crime era that started in 1994-95 with the tough on crime bill that is infamous. When you think of the fathers, the mothers that were caught up into that, and then the sons and the daughters and so on and so forth, the cyclical effect, something has to be done to work on that collateral impact that impacted education, that impacted economics, that impacted access, and as I talk about in this book, that impacted identity. So as I wrote this book is largely about what I call a cultural identity crisis due to this incarceration thing and its impact. And I asked the question, and I tried to answer the question, what do we do to change that piece? Which is deep, which is tough, which I don't see many correctional outlets doing. Speaking to those deeper aspects, whether it is economics, whether it is the economy, whether it is, education, and certainly getting into what it means to be yourself, the identity piece. Huge. But when you think of therapeutic or corrective, to use the corrections mentality on how to deal with that issue, our correction systems, our courts, it's hard for them to look deeper into those truncated, deeper aspects of why we see mass incarceration. I would say even internally, from our minority cultures, that's even difficult as well because we got to go deep on this. Because this whole criminal justice thing has been embedded as a weapon against us, which has worked to some degree and has hurt a lot of us to the place where our identity has been impacted. So throwing all that in, that is what underlies this book. And in our next podcast, I would love to get into. I didn't want to just expose what I thought was an issue, but I wanted to talk about solutions. So there are definitely some solutions in this book, and we'll speak a little bit back about that in the next podcast. But I definitely wanted to kind of, again, what your appetite on this book called The Seeds of Toby, what led to it, obviously the work of Michelle Alexander with her amazing book, The New Jim Crow, but also broadening out off of that, and many other authors, I might add, that have spoken to this issue. How do we bring this into the criminal justice system and make due change? Let me say that again. How do we bring the new Jim Crow and what we've learned? And yes, to point fingers, but then, okay, what do we do to change it? Not only in the sense of front end things like policing, juries, courtrooms, diversity, and those things, but this book speaks to, okay, those things are needed. We did them. What about the generations of people that have been in the criminal justice system who have adopted it to some degree as their identity? And that's what this book is about and what it talks about. So thank you for being on this third podcast. Hopefully you're having a great 2025. Again, The Seeds of Toby is out. Amazon, Barnes & Noble, other major places. This is for those who are in the public defender office, certainly, but any of those folks that are into criminal justice reform, the criminal justice motif that's going on or maybe going on post 2025, and those that are interested in change. Certainly, it fits now that it is February 2025, Black History Month, a good read for those that might be interested. So thank you to any and all that jumped in on this podcast. This is the Seeds of Toby podcast with Dr. Donovan Bailey. It's been a pleasure to kind of chime in on the book and get out and get it. Have a great February, great 2025.